Welcome to Geopolitical Horizon. Today we're going to look at the situation in the Middle East and the implications of the US strike against Iranian-supported militias in Syria. So last week the US decided to conduct a military strike against Shia militias inside Syria after the attacks against US military forces in Iraq, also in Erbil. Now, the question is, why have these military strikes been going on against US forces in Iraq over the last year? Well, as you may remember, Qasem Soleimani, the IRGC leader, was assassinated and killed by US drone strike in January last year. And after Qasem Soleimani was killed, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, came out in an interview and he said that US military forces must now leave the Middle East. And what Hassan Nasrallah meant by saying that was that they will conduct attacks against US military forces in the Middle East until US military forces leave the Middle East. He also said specifically that they will not conduct attacks against US civilians, but US military forces. Now, there have also been conducted attacks against US contractors that have been cooperating with US military forces. And there have also been other casualties, also some civilian casualties among US civilians, but mostly there have been attacks against US military forces and US military bases inside the Green Zone in Baghdad and also other US military bases in Iraq. The question is, will those attacks stop now that the US conducted a strike against the Shia militias inside Syria? No, probably not. So the question is, the Biden administration made a decision to conduct a US military strike against the Shia militias inside Syria just after a month after they came into office. So was that a good decision? Well, I think the Biden administration and President Biden wanted to, stand strong and appear strong. But the question is, how tactical was this? We must remember, during the attacks against ISIL and during the war against ISIL in the Middle East and in Syria and Iraq, the Shia militias were very, very forceful in fighting against the ISIL forces. The Shia militias were some of the most forceful, strong, and resilient forces on the ground. And they conducted a long range of attacks against the ISIL forces. And now recently, ISIL has become even stronger in Syria and in the borderlands with Syria and Iraq. They now may have as many as 10,000 soldiers. And their funds could be as high as, 300 to 500 million US dollars, and not as high as during the war, but still, the ISIL is a substantial force inside Syria and Iraq, and they will probably continue their attacks and they will continue, their recruitment. So the question is, if ISIL is able to return in a strong, form, potentially also with a physical base and position as they had, or something similar to what they had. The question is, will the Shia militias then be as forceful against ISIL? There are many questions now. The US relied more or less on Shia militias in their war against ISIL. And now I think, these conducted these attacks, there are many tactical, decisions that have to be made, and there are many variations, nuances of these decisions. And I think the Biden administration tried to limit and moderate the attacks as much as possible, as they also said. But still, I think that the attacks against US military forces in Iraq will continue, and they will not stop. And they may even be reinforced when the US conducted these military strikes against Shia militias in Syria. So the question is, what are the options? What can the US do? Well, I think we are slowly moving in a direction where the US is pulling out its military forces from the Middle East. But it will probably remain and have its base, and its support missions. Probably also continue with, its defensive support for Saudi Arabia and other countries with Patriot missiles, as we see. But, the US military presence in Iraq, which has now been ongoing for many years, it remains to be seen how that continues. But I think that the strike that the Biden administration conducted against the Shia militias inside Syria will only reinforce the Shia militias' intent and willingness to attack US military forces inside Iraq. And so that is, bears basically the assessment out of this situation. Thank you so much for joining, and I'll see you next week.